Welcome to another episode of Digging Deeper. I am Bradley Martin, Pastor Bradley Martin, or Dr. Martin, whatever you want to call me is fine. And I am thrilled that you are with me for another edition. As you can see by if you're watching us on our social media or YouTube or any of the like, you can see that we are starting a brand new study, and I'll explain that here momentarily. Let me just remind you that you can find us on any of your favorite social media platforms through our church, One Church, here in Seneca, South Carolina. You can also reach us on, or you can find us on your favorite podcasting streaming, whether it be Spotify or Apple or any of those such. You can search for us as Digging Deeper. You might have to put my name or something in there to find it exactly where it is, but you can certainly find that. And we appreciate you liking and subscribing and sharing that with others so that we can get the word out about the gospel of Jesus Christ through this platform. Again, if you've been with us, we just completed a study on the Lord's Prayer, and so we are about to jump into a brand new study on worship. And it is a very touchy subject for some, and some are afraid because it is very offensive to some. I'll say this probably many times that it is one of, if not most, the most divisive things that we have encountered, not only in our contemporary culture, but also in the history of it. And I'm going to give you an overview today of kind of what that looked like. If you do not know, I do have a seminary background in church music, so I did have the ability to go back and study. Well, I studied that for my degree, as well as the performance side of music. So I do have a lot of background in the hymnology and the church history as far as music and worship goes. So I wanted to share a little bit of that. This is not going to be a submersion in any of this because if I did, we never get through. Today, we're going to look at the history kind of from 10,000 feet or from outer space, depending upon whatever you want to get to call it, that view so that we can just kind of get an idea. Because what's going to happen is that in order for us to kind of know where we are, we need to kind of know where we came from, right? I think part of the problem is that we only live in a box, and it's not just us as Christians, but us, the world in general, but specifically talking to us people who are the body of Christ, the bride of Christ, all that good kind of stuff. We live in a box. And so we like our box, we like our comfortable box. And if somebody else has a different box or living in a different box, then we don't like that box because we like our box. It's not comfortable for us. And so, for instance, you may have if you've ever traveled, if you're like on vacation or something, you're like, hey, I want to go to worship on a Sunday or whatever day that might be. I would highly suggest that. It's very good to get out and see other styles. I hate to use the word styles, but it's kind of the word we're looking at right now. It's always good to get your feet wet in some other um, things that people do. When I was in college, when I went to Clemson, I was a religion minor. I know that's kind of difficult to believe for that kind of public school. And it wasn't like there was no study in the Bible there. It was all just religion. But one of the things that I really did like about it was when we had to go out and visit other denominations and other kind of traditions that people do. And it made me appreciate really what I was raised up in and kind of what that has kind of morphed into and transformed into where we are now at one. And I didn't really plan on going into the philosophies where we're at now, but they may kind of come out and cross over just as we kind of move through this, because I think that, well, I don't think, I know that the biggest part of worship is to be biblically based, and I truly believe that we are. And I'll talk a lot about that kind of as we move forward. But let's make an agreement here before we start. I'm probably going to say something that's going to offend somebody. I'm not doing it intentional. I'm not critiquing your style of worship. I'm not critiquing how somebody else worships. I'm not saying that ours is 100% the best, okay? Because if you went, let me just say this, church health is not it is not an indication of what kind of style you do. I might have said that backwards, but your style does not indicate how healthy your church is. Worship is something that we do worship, and we'll talk about again a lot about this. We'll dive deeper into some of these aspects of it, but I wanted to give you a broad introduction and just kind of give you my heart for what this is. Um, there is a lot of people that are what we have in our older generations now that were, let's say my parents' age, 60, 70, 80 years old. So they grew up in a different time frame than my children even have. And it's hard to believe that at some point in time soon, some of my children will be having children. And so there's multiple generations that are going on. And it has never been God's intention. I don't think you'll ever find that and in the heart of God to be divisive and to say that this is the only way that you can do this, or this is the proven way to do this, or I enjoyed this. The only time that he accepted an offering and didn't accept an offering of worship was back in Genesis when Cain and Abel both gave their offerings. And it had nothing to do with the style of it, it had to do with the heart. So that being said, I'm going to probably say some things. I hope I say some things that stretch your thinking. I hope that is something you found in all of these sessions that I want you to think. It is very important that you go to a Bible believing where a man of God is preaching the word and you trust him in what he says. But as mine says, I'm just a man, and I want you to go and search it out for yourself too. Because if the only part that you ever get is what we give you, then you're not growing. You need to search these things, and you need to study, and you need to research, and you need to listen to a multitude of people. And sometimes you need to listen to people that may not line up exactly with what you do. I'm not saying to listen to those all the time, but those are the types of people that will stretch you. And actually, I go back to my time at Clemson when I was studying religion. I came from a background where it was very, very small country church. That's the only culture that I was submerged in. I really didn't know much about anything else or what anybody else believed. But, buddy, when I started studying all the different philosophies and other different religions and what they believe, that personally made me stronger. For some, that is a difficult thing, and that's why sometimes when our children go off to college and they hear a worldview of things instead of a biblical worldview, that they sometimes go in a different direction in their thinking spiritually, and that's why you have to give them what they need at home before you send them out. You cannot depend on school to teach them. We don't. This has turned into something different than I was going to talk about, but I'm a teacher, and you can't even depend on me as a pastor and a teacher or others who are the same leaders in the church that are teachers. You can't depend on us to teach your kids morality or the way they need to live their life with God. It's just not going to be that way. But that being said, let's set that aside and let's talk about worship. Again, one of the most divisive things that we have, I titled this "How Great Thou Art," simply for the fact that it is one of my favorite hymns that we do. And what I'm going to try to do throughout this whole entire study is to give you the whys and wherefores of what we do, and also kind of do a little hymnology study and kind of tie that into some of the more modern things that we do. And "How Great Thou Art" is a song, is a hymn that, and we'll talk about this at the end. But every week we're going to do a hymn study or a song study, and kind of dig that in a little bit deeper. I do not believe that you should preach from a hymn or a song. Those are not sacred texts that are infallible, inerrant from God. They are things that have been um, written by great men and women. They are not replaced, that they're not a replacement for the Bible. And so be very leery when you hear people start preaching from hymn books. Okay. There are some good music, good worship music is biblically based, and you can certainly pull out verses where they were inspired of the Holy Spirit to do such. But that's not what I'm doing here. That's just a personal belief on mine, and you may disagree with that. And you may be a pastor that preaches that way, or you may be in a church with a pastor that has preached out of hymns and stuff. And that's their prerogative. That's between them and God. It's not my job to judge, but I'm telling you from personal experience, I'm going to preach what the text of the Bible says, and I'm going to tie that into the application of where we're at today. And that's what we're going to do. We're not studying necessarily a book of the Bible like we have last little bit. There's going to be a broad range of things. So, How Great Thou Art is the title for this, and we're going to move forward. I have a blank sheet here that just says historical worship, and I'm just going to talk a little bit about some things from a very high view, from a very zoomed out view. If you were looking at worship from outer space, this is kind of how we're going to look at it today. There are certainly a lot of studies, and there's certainly we could look at every individual period that has been, and this is not a musicology class. This is not even a hymnology class. This is a study on worship and kind of how it's kind of a transition and more throughout the years. And I'm going to share a little bit about what I have experienced as both a pastor, music leader, and all that such throughout my tenure as doing that, and still continue to do some of those things as well. When I graduated from seminary, that was the late '90s and early 2000s was a big transition year. And I don't have necessarily specifics about that, but I'll kind of share from my perspective. But let's go back to where worship all in the beginning. I'll share here in a little bit some verses in kind of our key text for the series will be the passage in Genesis. I think it's Genesis 22, where Abraham is going to sacrifice Isaac, and we'll talk about that, and also from Deuteronomy as well. But shakah was the Hebrew word for to fall prostrate, to fall down, bow down. You see that in a number of passages in the Old Testament when the there was a go all the way back to Genesis 4, I believe, is where Cain and Abel had their problems. You had this sense of bringing in your offering as a sign of worship throughout the entireness of the Old Testament. You have this sense of bringing in your fruits, your produce, your vegetables. They would sacrifice animals. You would sacrifice sometimes your firstborn of whatever. You give that first fruits to God. When the Israelites were coming out of Egypt in the wilderness, you were moving toward a centralized place of worship. They had instructions to build the tabernacle, which was carried with them, and so you had the first time where you went to a place to worship. When David became king later on, he had the thought, the inspiration to build a temple, and God did not allow him to build that, but allowed Solomon, his son. So you had temple worship from there on, where there was a specific place and you had specific instructions where you would have daily worship and also yearly atonement for sins. And we've spoken about that. You have the Day of Atonement where that would be the big one where the high priest would go in on behalf of all of the nation. You saw this continually as we transitioned to Jesus's time with the temple. They actually one of the charges that they brought against Jesus was they said he was going to destroy the temple, when in fact what he said was destroy this temple and I will rebuild it in 3 days, which was um, a foreshadowing of his death, burial, and resurrection. And so even let me back up when the temple was destroyed in, forgive me, I don't know this date exactly, but um, by the powers that came in and took out um, the Israelites to the captivity, they rebuilt the temple. The temple was there in Jesus' time. There still was that temple worship where they would go and worship daily. You'd have the daily teachings in the synagogues and in the temple. And we know that in 70 AD that the temple was destroyed by the Romans, and it has not been rebuilt since. And so then you had a movement at the beginning of Acts where you had a gathering in places, whether it was in the temple before it was destroyed, or even as they gathered wherever they gathered. So they started building, creating churches. You read through Paul's missionary journeys where he established churches all throughout Asia Minor. You had these places where it was outside of Jerusalem. And again, go back if you want to go back in a study that we did on the book of Acts, when Jesus commissioned us to go to the outermost parts of the world. That's where they were taking the gospel and they were establishing these buildings. Now, on this side, we know, and I hope you understand that worship is not a place you go to necessarily, and it's not a building. The church is not a building. The church is us. But just to give you historical context of where all that was, that's why I'm saying all this. So you have this thought that, especially through the first through the 14th, 15th century on this side of Jesus' birth, where the music was very chanty, if I may say that. So there was not a lot of words. If you go back and you hear the earliest history of music, you can hear these Gregorian chants or other chants that they had in worship. They would sing psalms. Paul wrote in Ephesians, instructed us as we sing our hymn songs and spiritual songs. And so this is not a new phenomenon. Now, most people don't understand when he's talking about hymn, that's not the modern hymn that we have now, and I'll explain that by just saying that most of our modern hymns were written in the 19th and 20th, even sometimes the 21st centuries, when Jesus took the disciples out of the upper room. It says they sang a hymn. They did not sing "Blessed be the tie that binds," even though that's traditionally what a lot of traditional churches do or sing, and there's nothing wrong with that. But it wasn't written back then, so I can assure you that that was not what they sang there. Now we had the Catholic Church was pretty much ruling everything. There was some corruption that was noted by many. Of course, you go back again. This is very light as far as what we're digging into, because I'm trying to get to today's world. But there was a lot of inter-corruption. They wouldn't allow common people to own a copy of the scriptures. It wasn't until the printing press was invented that it could be mass produced, and even others that created that and started not translating the Bible, but just printing the Bible were actually killed because of that. Um, so along comes people like Martin Luther, who basically saw the corruption in the Catholic Church, and um, in 1541, I believe, wrote his 95 Theses of all the charges of things that he has noted of corruption wise in the Catholic Church. And that started what we call on this side the Reformation, and really um, changed worship from that point on. You had a lot of theological things that changed, and a lot of structural things that changed in the church. But one of the biggest things was what we sang, what people actually did in worship. We still do a lot of the same things that they did back then. They would do the sacraments, the Lord's Supper, the Eucharist. There would be the singing of the Psalms and singing of other things and chants. Um, but now we're moving into more of the printed side of things, and so a lot of our um, not modern hymns, but a lot of our more modern than that time came from that. Martin Luther certainly was the author of several hymns from that era. Isaac Watts, another. And as you move from um, time period to time period or from style to style, you're always going to have somebody that disagrees with what you're going to. So the even the churches and the gatherings that started to sing these hymns, um, one of my favorite ones was "Oh God, Our Help in Ages Past." So you would have that being sung most likely in German at the time. It didn't go well with those who had come before. Just like as you moved more and more ahead, you have people like John Wesley that would write hymns. And as you see, we're starting to move more into our modern hymnody, whereas you're moving away from styles and things that people were comfortable with, and you're changing some things. Um, One of the biggest changes was kind of the Sunday school singing, the gospel singing. You have a lot of those hymns that were written at the beginning of the 20th century, late 19th, early of 20th century. I think back to songs like um, uh, many of the same hymns we call them, "I'll Fly Away," things that sound spiritual. The African American church, of course, sang spirituals. I've been singing spirituals for a long time, and a lot of those moved into the church, and some are still sang today. Some modern or today culture churches still sing a lot of those same songs, and those were a little bit less heavy wordage wise and theologically wise necessarily than those that came before them. So even if you had a hymn book in front of you and you flip through, there's going to be a lot of hymns that you don't recognize and don't sing, and even if you sing those in your church, you won't sing some of those songs because those aren't the more familiar ones. And you may sing more of the lighter ones with hymns and choruses. Like I keep going back to "I'll Fly Away," but that's one that's popped into my head. Even "How Great Thou Art," um, and its changes. What we have now is hymns, is verses, and I say hymns and choruses, but it's verses and choruses to where you have a verse saying and then a chorus and a verse and chorus. A lot like what we're doing now in our more modern music, which has changed. Um, but before I get to there, there was a movement to the crusades that happened, the Great Awakenings that happened in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and you had these songs being sang. And so if you go back and you even into the middle of the 1900s, where you had the Billy Graham Crusades, which is the what we in our more modern era go back and look at, you would see a lot of these same songs sung. How Great Thou Art was one that George Beverly Shea, which was the song leader for Billy Graham, one he would do all the time. Now there's hundreds of those songs, and those are just the ones that popped in my mind at one time. So not saying that one is right or one is wrong. When we got to the 70s, the 1970s into the 1980s, you had this really simplifying and somewhat oversimplification of worship. I think, in my opinion, we went through a period where we had, and I can remember this as a child, we had these children's songs, and some of those children's songs kind of leaked. Sounds it was unintentional, but they did leak into um, what I would not want to call big church, but adult church, adult worship. And sometimes some churches would sing these songs over and over. And that's been the biggest complaint and biggest thing, where they sing the same words and the same things over and over and over again. And again, I'm not saying that's right or wrong or indifferent. I don't like when I hear people refer to those as 7-Eleven songs, because that's very inaccurate in some cases. But because this is some of the same songs that they sang, the church hymnal, the redback hymnal songs, are the same way. You would sing the same words over and over again. Spirituals would be over and over again. They would. There's something about repetition that brings it to your heart. And so there's nothing, absolutely zero wrong with doing those kinds of things. When we got into the 1980s, that great decade that most people my age, which would be all people my age, would grow up in, you have this kind of battle of the wheels between church, the bigger churches or the mega churches were starting to explode and get bigger. And some of those were doing some different things in worship, while you had kind of an alternative things that we were listening to. You had things listening kind of, it wasn't, I don't know the necessarily date that contemporary music radio happened, but it was in this time frame, late 70s and early 80s. And so there was some things that you listened to on the radio. There was some, at the time, some harder things. I think back to like Petra and things like that people at the time would consider hard rock, and they really weren't. If you put them up against things today, I can remember as a child listening to some of that stuff, and it didn't really appease me. It didn't really appeal to me at the time. And then again, that's okay. There's all kinds of music and stuff out there. Whereas like now we have any kind of music is readily available. You can pop up anything on your iTunes or Spotify or whatever you listen to, and can listen to whatever. Well, back then it was that was that was a new thing that was happening. There was no YouTube. There was no you couldn't just go and listen to whatever you wanted. At the time, you had to listen to what was on the radio. You had Bill Gaither who was doing his video thing and such. And I grew up listening to a lot of that stuff, and that's some of what formed me. So you have all these things that are coming together. And the late 80s and early 90s was a strenuous time theologically for some. I don't remember a lot about this in my home church, because we were, while we were Southern Baptist Church, I don't think we were like totally submerged into all the polity and the politics that went on through there. But as I personally went to seminary in 1997, I learned that they were just coming out of a period of time in the Southern Baptist Church that was a battle theologically between conservatives and liberal thinking inside the church. There was a change in leadership from liberal thinking to more conservative in that body. And so you had some different things going on. You had big churches get bigger. You still didn't have the number of big churches like we have today, but it was just starting. And so you had this big divide. When I was in seminary, we were the big catchphrase was blended worship. And so I don't really know what blended worship really even is defined as. I know what we tried to do. We tried to take a lot of hymns and then add choruses or things to them. And even that was very difficult to appease everybody. And a lot of worship leaders got burnt out and just left. Just got tired of being because a lot of the time that the problems of the churches that were going on were blamed on music. You had churches that were thriving, that were doing one particular style, and you had some that were not. And sometimes even inside your own building. Most of the time during the late 90s and early 2000s, instead of going fully one way or the other, you would have two or three different services. I went to a church one time where we had a contemporary service and a blended service, and really the blended service was, well, the blended service was actually contemporary, and the contemporary service was, I mean, it was just a weird phenomenon. It wasn't kind of what you think of nowadays, but you had this big battle going on between what is the way to do this and what is not the way to do this. You had lots of people that got mad and started their own churches. You had a lot of new churches that had begun in the last, let's say, 20 years. Some of them for the right reason, and some of them not for the right reason. Just point blank, there are some out there that did not start for the right reason. I do think our church, in its history, started for the right reason. There was a need to reach a particular group. And so you have these battles going on, and you still have these battles going on today. It seems to have quieted down where there seems to be more divide. Again, style is not indicative of church health. I know plenty of churches that are number wise big that are doing traditional things. They're doing hymns. I know churches that are stylistically contemporary and modern that are small. But numbers and style do not indicate the the health of a church. And so we end up today with less people that worship, that go to church with the same people they did even 5, 10 years ago. Whereas church used to be more of a family thing where you would go and you would go to church with your family. That's less now because we like different things. We have some people that like drums and some people that don't like drums. We have some people that like a full production where you have lights and videos and all this kind of stuff, which is more of our flavor, of our style. And you have some that's very distasteful. And again, it's a style thing. Everybody has their opinion about which way they want to go. But that's a 5, 7,000 year history in about 15, 20 minutes. Again, there's a lot more in there, and there's a lot more to come. And we are in it's something that you have to understand. Music and styles continue to morph. They continue to transition. What we did even 5 years ago at one, we're not doing that same. We're always not reinventing ourselves, but we're always trying to keep things fresh and keep things relevant to the people that we're trying to reach. And so there's always going to be a change of styles. So I would dare say that in 10 years, if I have the same kind of study, first of all, whatever we're doing right now, this video and podcast, it's going to be totally different in 10 years. But if whatever is being done and I'm still doing this kind of stuff and I'm talking about the same subject, there's going to be another shift, another transition because it just continually changes. There's not going to be any thing that stays the same. So, I said a lot to say there's been a lot of changes over the last thousands of years inside the church. Let me read this to you, and we'll dive into this a lot more. But there's a couple of things that I think is important to note here, kind of moving forward about really the heart of worship. There's a lot of songs that come to mind every time I say something. My wife will laugh at me. Somebody will say something and I'll start singing a song. I just said the heart of worship, which is a worship song that came out in the early 2000s. In Genesis 22, 1 through 5, God just went through a lot of things with Abraham. They just had a son, Isaac, in their old age. He was the promised heir to somebody who was too old to have kids. And so now God's going to see how much he really is willing to worship him and love him. And I think there's two words, the worship and love are the key aspects of this. After these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham, and he said, Here I am. And he said, Take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, key phrase there, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer there as a burnt offering. A burnt offering is it's a worship offering that he was supposed to give, that people were supposed to give on one of those mountains, of which I will tell you. So Abraham rose early in the morning and saddled his donkey and took two of his young men with him and his son Isaac. And he cut the wood for the burnt offerings, and he rose and went to the place of which God had told him. On the third day, Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place afar. Then Abraham said to his young men, Stay here with the donkey. I and the boy will go over there and worship and come again to you. Again, there's a lot there to unpack. I'm not going to do that this week. I will do that in the coming weeks. But I wanted you to understand that the phrases worship and love. And while there are two separate phrases, that shakah, hope I pronounced that Hebrew word correctly, is a word that is used for worship a lot in the Old Testament, where it means to bow down to or to fall prostrate to somebody, but just to be willing to humble yourself in order to worship somebody else. And love. Later on, when Moses is given the Ten Commandments, number one is this, and he repeats this in Deuteronomy 6, verse 5. He also repeats this in all the Gospels when Jesus is asked, What is the greatest commandment? He goes back to this one. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. So when we talk about worship, we talk about falling down, bowing down, and loving. So what do you love? Whatever you love is what you worship. Whatever you love the most is what you worship the most. You can look at a lot of indicators to see what you truly love. You can look at your calendar, see how much time you spend doing some things. You can look at your checkbook and see where your money is going, and that's what you love the most. Or you can look at who you spend time with, or how much time you spend with God, studying, praying, listening to podcasts such as these, watching videos, all the such. How much time do you spend in corporate worship with others? That's where your treasure is. And that's where that's when he says where your treasure is, that's where your heart is. That's why also when the rich young ruler comes to Jesus and he says this very verse, he says, I've done all these things. I've followed all the commandments. And he said, what else do I need to do to inherit eternal life? Jesus says, go do all that and then go sell everything you have. Because he knew that the love of his life was his money. Until we're willing to put God as number one, then we're not going to be where he wants us to be. So whenever you think and say, okay, and again, I'm not talking throughout this whole process, I'm not talking about going to do something. So I'm not talking about, do you go to church and worship? Do you do this? Do you go to church? Do you give? I'm not talking about that. That is not the indication of your love and your worship for God. your indication is because when I was leading worship weekly, I most of y'all who are listening to this know I'm in our worship band. I sing and play the keys, and often when our worship leader is away, that's a way I have to fill in for him. But when I was doing this full time, let's just say that, well, when I was doing this weekly, I would always make it known that if you're coming into the building and you're expecting me to lead you in worship, then you're not going to have it. Okay. I can't, as a worship leader, walk into the building and say, all right, we're going to worship now. It is something that you do, and you do constantly, and you do every day, every minute you're worshiping. Um, and people say, well, I can go out and be in the woods and worship. That's true. You can, and you should. Whenever you're out in the woods, you should observe the beauty that God's created, or on the lake. Um, but that is not a that's not the substitute for worshiping. And again, I'm not talking about worshiping with the church that you go to, with the brothers and sisters, whatever you want to say. What fills your heart? Okay, the music you listen to on the radio, the people you listen to, the things you allow yourself to be around. That's what you worship. So I promised you that I would share weekly, or every time, kind of a hymn study. This is How Great Thou Art. If you've been in church for any length of time, you will certainly know and be familiar with this. I've got some notes down, so I'm looking down at those. I'm not ignoring the camera here, but this was originally written by a Swedish author by the name of Carl Boberg. He lived from 1859 to 1940, and I don't speak Swedish. And so I'm going to mispronounce these things because I'm actually going to show you one of the original texts here momentarily. But let me back up and give you a little bit of hymnology, if you will, of hymn study. When you're looking at these things, this is just a copy that I pulled from the internet, just a search, just an image. That has there are four verses of this hymn and then a refrain or a chorus. We have done this in a more modern way. So let me when I was in seminary, Dr. Hugh McElrath is one of the leading scholars on church music at the time. He was a professor at Southern, where I went. He had just retired, so he wasn't there full time. But the times that I was able to hear him speak was very powerful. And he's gone on to be with the Lord now for several years. But one of the things that he always said, and I will take wherever I go, it is not the music that should be what inspires you, what makes you worship. Um, and I say that because often it does. We can hear a tune. Now, the tune that we hear, if I were to sit down and play this without singing it, you would automatically know what the words are, the majority of you. Or if I played anything, most of us would be called to memory about something, or a word that's in this hymn or line. There's times that I start playing things, I'm like, what is that song? And I that's just because I'm getting old. I can't remember. Um, but often there are several hymns. If you go back and you have a hymnal or a hymn book, you will see that there are oftentimes that there's multiple versions of these hymns inside there with different tunes. And so what would happen often is you would have an author of the writer or poet, because most of these older hymns are written in poetry form. If you look, this copy does not have, but you will have numbers at the bottom, which are the meter of the hymn, and they would fall into some sort of meter. And so whether or not they were sung with this tune, so the words could have been written, and often were written by a different person than the tune was. And sometimes the words were put in a different tune years later. You can have different, if you, I can remember the last time I had a hymnal in front of me, there were several hymns that were sang in different tunes. And so don't get hung up by this. So don't get offended by churches that put it to different music in their services. I think it's very important that we study hymns. I think hymns have been a big part of our history. Um, One of the things that I am excited about in our more modern hymnody, and I use that intentionally, is there is a movement back to more thicker, theologically driven words that we sing. There are a lot of songs that we incorporate in our worship that are full of words. And I think the more words you have, if they are intentional words, good words, solid words, they do point people to Jesus and point you to worship. Whereas 25, 30 years ago, it would have been the same chorus over and over. Now, we still have some of those songs that we use. And there's sometimes that we even have disagreements with some of the wordings in some of the songs. And so we change some of the words at times. But this is How Great Thou Art, again, written by Carl Boberg originally. And he lived from 1851 to 1940. This was first published in a newspaper. And I'm going to butcher this, but it was Monsteros Tignion in March of 1886. So you do the math, that was that long ago. The original writings had 9 stanzas with no refrain at the end. This has been translated into several different languages. I will show you this. I am almost positive that this is Swedish, although I think the bottom one is the second version of that, and I think that's in German. But you can see that even the tune, if you read music, that the tune is not anywhere the same about what we sing now. And the words, if you could translate that into your head, which I can't, the stanzas translate different than what we have in our most latest iteration of this song. So let me give you an example. The first verse in the original would have said, "O thou great God, when I the world consider which thou hast made by thine almighty word, and how the web of life thy wisdom guideth." Burst forth into the song of praise, "O thou great God, O thou great God." So this and other hymns are going to be translated and changed throughout history. You have this actually taken to Russian, and I will not even try to pronounce that. And it was published in Russian in 1908, in something that is translated as symbols, as a word, symbols. Now, as I'm trying to flip all the stuff, it was translated into German in 1912 by Manfred von Geen of Estonia. See how my German is. Wie groß bist du was the title of that. They the information that I have researched, that the tune was very close to the 1894 Swedish, except they changed some of the rhythms and harmonizations and so forth. So it was first translated into English by Gustav Johnson in 1925 in a periodical produced called The Children's Friend. And it was translated, and what we have now as this by Stuart Hine in 1923, when he was embarking on a mission trip to the Western Ukraine. This is where he learned the Russian version, and he saw the Carpathian Mountains. And so this is kind of where, in his description of it says, in the very first Carpathian mountain village to which the writer climbed, he stood in the street, sang a gospel hymn, and read aloud John chapter 3. Among sympathetic listeners stood the Russian village schoolmaster, but a storm was gathering, and when it was evident that the missionary would not get any further that night, the friendly schoolmaster offered hospitality. Awe-inspiring was the mighty thunder. That's in one of the verses, echoing through, um, echoing through, pushing on the rider across the mountain frontier into Romania and there into Bukovina, where he found believers. Together with the young people through the woods and forest glades, he wandered and heard the birds sing sweetly in the trees. Instinctively, the young people burst into song, accompanied by on their mandolins and guitars, the only song perfectly fitting the scene, "How Great Thou Art," to those words. So you can see that even in one of the hymns that we sing, that there's been many different adaptations to that. And so be be open-minded when it comes to these things. Now, that doesn't say you need to be liberal with your thinking. You still should look at all of the words to there, because the words are the most important thing, as Dr. McElrath taught us many years ago. The words are what points us to Jesus, or in this case to God. Same person, I understand that, same being. The music reminds us of the words. And so when you hear a song come up, you should always think of the words and not the tune, and pay attention to what you're singing. So again, we'll do several of these things, but I wanted to show you this one in particular. This one was, I mentioned earlier that this one was used significantly in the Billy Graham Crusades. George Beverly Shea would lead those with those great massive choirs and singing "How Great Thou Art." And so many that are a little bit older than us, me in particular, my parents' age particularly, would have seen these and heard about these crusades and heard this song sang in a certain way, in a certain mode. So that's good. I think everybody's got their style. I think we're all created differently. I think some of us have, because you can get in the car with somebody and tell exactly what kind of style that they like, whether they're listening to country music or Christian music or classical music, whatever. You can typically find pretty quick what kind of things that interest them. If you listen to what I listen to, you may not figure it out, because I've listened to a conglomeration of a lot of stuff, and I think that's good. I think it's good to be very open-minded and very stylistically open-minded. Again, theologically, be solid. Don't get, don't mix up the two, just because somebody sings in a different style. And I'll end with this. I had the opportunity to travel to Peru on a mission trip several years ago now. And this is my thought when it comes to style. And this is why I say there is no one particular style that is right. And there's no particular song that's right. Because when I went to Peru, their worship sounded much different than what I had ever heard before. And it's simply because they're in a different country with a different language and different styles and different everything. And so if you go to the backwoods of Africa, when our teams go to Rwanda, they don't worship like we do. They don't have, they're not driven by lights and by electric guitars or microphones or keyboards, or because they simply don't have that. They do with what they have. and they have adapted that into worship. And so that is why I'm very quick to really shut you down if you start demeaning other kinds of worship. And we'll talk about John chapter 4 when Jesus says, "There's coming a day where you worship in spirit and truth." We'll talk about that. I'm out of time for this week, but there's a lot of stuff that's coming, a lot of biblically based worship stuff, and that's where we're heading. We're not talking. I know today was a lot about me discussing the history of it. Um, but I want you to understand everything that I do and believe and everything that my church believes is biblically based, from every song to every word that's preached. So make sure that that's the mind that you have. Don't throw out hymns just because they're old. Don't trash new songs just because they're new. Everything's got a place and everything's got a time, as long as they are theologically centered, God centered. They lift up the name of Jesus and they point people to him as their Savior. Let me pray for you, and then we'll end this week, and then we'll catch you again next week. God, thank you for this time. I thank you that you made us all different. I thank thank you that you made us, our likes and our dislikes and our interests and everything about us. It's just unique. It's just different. And I think that's what makes the church such a beautiful thing, that we can all come together. And we may not like this style, or we may not like that style. We can come together and worship and love you. I thank you. I pray that we would continue to learn more about you. I pray that our daily worship is a continuing of just lifting you up. And you said, when you're lifted up, that you'll draw all men and women to you. And that's our job here. Thank you for everything you've done, and we give you the honor and glory in Jesus' name. Amen. Thanks again for joining us, and we'll catch you next time.